Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Charles had always believed he'd built something solid. 12 years of marriage to Amanda, a spacious house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, 2 vacations a year, and weekend dinners at upscale restaurants. He worked as an architect at a respected firm, often traveling to oversee projects in different states. Amanda didn't work outside the home. Since their 3rd year of marriage, when she asked to quit her job at a boutique, citing stress, Charles had shouldered all the expenses alone. At the time, it hadn't felt like a burden. He earned enough to support them comfortably, and Amanda seemed happy managing the house, joining book clubs, attending yoga classes, and meeting friends for long lunches. She filled her days with activities that, at least on the surface, appeared genuine and fulfilling. That Thursday in September, Charles was in Chicago overseeing the final phase of a commercial project. The construction was ahead of schedule, and the client requested a few changes that could be handled remotely, without needing him on site. Charles decided to return home a day earlier than planned. He caught a mid-morning flight and landed just after noon. He drove straight home, excited at the thought of surprising Amanda. Maybe they could go out for dinner, watch a movie, or just enjoy the afternoon together. It had been weeks since they'd spent any real quality time alone. When he pulled into the garage at 3 in the afternoon, the first thing he noticed was that Amanda's car wasn't there. The silver SUV he'd bought her for her 40th birthday was missing. Charles frowned. He entered through the kitchen door, set his suitcase down on the floor, and walked through the house. Everything was neat, quiet, and undisturbed. There was no sign of Amanda, no note on the fridge, no message on his phone letting him know she'd gone out. Charles picked up his phone and dialed her number, feeling a vague unease he couldn't quite explain. Amanda answered on the second ring. "Hey, sweetie," she said, her voice calm, almost lazy. "Everything okay?" "Everything's great," Charles replied, keeping his tone casual. "Just missed you. What are you up to?" "Oh, I'm just relaxing on the couch, watching TV. There's this reality show I started today, the one where people renovate houses. It's actually pretty good." Charles glanced toward the living room window. The couch was empty, immaculate, with the pillows perfectly arranged. "That's cool," he said slowly. "Which episode is it?" There was a brief pause, just 2 seconds of silence that felt like an eternity. I think it's the 3rd or 4th. Not sure, I started watching in the middle." Charles felt a tightness in his chest. Her voice carried that forced casual tone people use when trying to mask nervousness. "Got it. Well, I'll let you keep watching. Talk later." "Okay, love. Bye." Charles hung up and stood motionless in the middle of the living room for a moment, the phone still in his hand. Something was off. Very off. He wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions without reason, but years of marriage teach you to pick up on nuances, on subtle shifts in behavior. And that phone call had been full of them. He decided to check. He opened the car tracking app they both shared, tied to their insurance for emergencies or theft. The GPS showed the SUV's real-time location. It had been parked for 40 minutes at a residential address 20 minutes away. Charles zoomed in on the map, and his stomach sank when he recognized the street. It was the neighborhood where Trevor lived. Trevor Duncan, his college friend, longtime buddy, and best man at their wedding. The same Trevor who came over for barbecues and spent Christmas with them whenever he wasn't visiting family out of town. Charles tried to reason it away. Maybe Amanda was helping Trevor with something. Maybe he needed a favor. But why lie about being home? Why make up a story about watching TV on the couch? He grabbed his car keys, left the house, and drove to the address. The drive was tense and silent, except for the faint sound of the radio he barely noticed. Charles parked 3 houses down from Trevor's place, at a spot where he had a clear view of the front entrance. And there it was, Amanda's silver SUV parked in the partially open garage, as if trying to stay discreet without fully hiding. Charles pulled out his phone and started recording video, capturing the license plate, the address visible on the mailbox, and the timestamp in the corner of the screen. Evidence. He didn't yet know exactly what he was documenting, but a deep instinct told him to record everything. 40 minutes passed. Charles stayed put, watching. Then the front door opened. Amanda stepped out, wearing the same outfit she'd had on that morning when he'd left for the airport 2 days earlier, a light blouse and jeans. But something was different. She was running her fingers through her blonde hair in a way that looked unmistakably like post-intimacy grooming. Trevor appeared behind her in the doorway, barefoot, in a t-shirt and shorts, smiling. They exchanged a few words Charles couldn't hear, and then Trevor briefly rested his hand on her shoulder before Amanda walked down the steps toward her car. Charles filmed it all, every second, every gesture. He waited until Amanda drove away in the opposite direction before heading home himself. He arrived 10 minutes before she did. He walked in, dropped his suitcase in the same spot, and sat down on the very couch she'd claimed to be watching TV from. When Amanda opened the kitchen door 15 minutes later, Charles was waiting, his expression unreadable. Charles. Amanda's eyes widened, her purse nearly slipping from her shoulder. You're back early. I thought you weren't getting in until tomorrow. Plans changed, Charles said calmly. Project finished ahead of schedule. How was your day? Amanda set her purse on the counter, trying to regain her composure. Oh, stayed home, watched some TV, organized a few things. Nothing special. That's funny, Charles said, leaning forward. Because when I called you an hour ago, you said you were on the couch watching a home renovation reality show. But when I got home 40 minutes ago, the house was empty. Amanda's face went pale. I went out after we talked. Needed to run to the market for a few things. Without any grocery bags? I forgot them in the car. Charles stood slowly, picked up the TV remote, and turned it on. He navigated to the viewing history. Nothing had been watched that day. Then he grabbed his phone, opened the video he'd recorded, and mirrored it to the big screen. Amanda appeared on screen, stepping out of Trevor's house, fixing her hair, Trevor smiling intimately in the doorway. Want to try again? Charles asked, his voice low and dangerously controlled. Amanda started shaking. Charles, I can explain. It's not what you think. Trevor needed help with a renovation. I went over to give him advice on colors, layout. He doesn't have an eye for that stuff. For 40 minutes you helped him pick paint colors? Charles cut in. And why lie? Why make up a story about being home? I didn't want you to get jealous or misunderstand. Charles let out a dry, humorless laugh. Misunderstand. Right. He picked up his phone again, dialed a number, and put it on speaker. It rang 3 times before Trevor answered. Hello? Trevor, Charles said, his voice firm. It's Charles. I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Was Amanda at your place today? Silence on the other end. Amanda reached for the phone, but Charles waved her off. Trevor? Charles pressed. Charles, man, look, it wasn't supposed to go down like this. How long? Charles asked sharply. 8 months, Trevor replied quietly. Charles, I'm really sorry. I never meant to. Charles hung up. He turned to Amanda, who was now crying, her hands covering her face. 8 months, he repeated, almost to himself. For 8 months, you've been sleeping with my best friend while I worked to pay for everything in this house. While I paid for your yoga classes, your lunches, your clothes. 8 months. Charles, please, let me explain. I felt so alone, you travel so much, I needed attention, someone who No, Charles interrupted, his voice hard as steel. Don't try to justify this. If you were unhappy, you talk to me. You don't cheat. And not with him. Not with Trevor. In the days that followed, Charles uncovered more. Much more. While Amanda slept, he went through her phone and found messages, not just with Trevor. There were explicit texts and photos with Marcus, the personal trainer Charles paid for her to see 3 times a week, along with plans for hotel meetups. There was even a third man, a divorced photographer named Ethan she'd met through one of her book clubs. The messages stretched back months, some over a year. Charles felt sick reading every word, every digitally whispered promise, every veiled mockery of him. In one exchange with Marcus, Amanda had written, "He doesn't notice anything. He's always so busy being the perfect provider that he forgot how to be a husband." Marcus replied, "Lucky me." Charles screenshot everything, every conversation, every photo, every shred of evidence. The next morning, he met with a lawyer and handed over the entire file. The divorce proceedings began immediately. The final confrontation took place 3 days later on a rainy afternoon, with Charles's attorney present. Amanda tried to argue, claiming she'd felt neglected, that Charles had been emotionally absent, that she'd needed more attention than he could give. Charles listened silently, arms crossed, face unreadable. When she finished, he simply said, "You had 3 men, Trevor, Marcus, Ethan. 3. This isn't about loneliness, Amanda. It's about character. Or the lack of it." Amanda tried to deny the others, but Charles laid out the screenshots one by one, like cards in a game of poker. With each new piece of evidence, her face grew paler, her defense crumbling until nothing remained but tears and feeble apologies. "I ruined everything," she sobbed. "I know. I ruined everything." "Yes," Charles agreed coldly. "You did." The divorce process lasted 4 months. Armed with irrefutable proof of her multiple affairs, Charles secured an extremely favorable settlement. He kept the house. He retained the vast majority of their joint assets. Amanda received only the minimum required by law, and even that was contested by Charles's attorney, who argued she hadn't contributed financially to the marriage for the past 9 years. With no recent work history and outdated professional skills, Amanda faced a reality she'd always avoided: she needed to get a job. She landed an administrative position at a veterinary clinic, a basic role handling data entry and phone calls. Her salary barely covered rent for a modest apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. Her book club friends distanced themselves once news of her multiple affairs spread. The social circle she'd cultivated using Charles's money vanished when that money dried up. Marcus, the personal trainer, blocked her on social media 2 weeks after the divorce announcement. Ethan, the photographer, simply stopped replying to her messages. Trevor lost Charles's friendship and eventually drifted away from Amanda too, burdened by guilt over what they destroyed. Charles, on the other hand, rebuilt himself. He sold the house and bought a modern apartment in a neighborhood closer to downtown, with a view of the river. Promoted at work, he accepted leadership of an ambitious new project that would expand the firm to the West Coast. He started going to the gym, lost weight, and updated his wardrobe. It wasn't about revenge, he realized, it was about rebuilding himself into someone stronger, sharper, and more self-aware. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Charles was at the grocery store on a Saturday afternoon, picking up ingredients for a dinner he was hosting for some colleagues. He was in the wine aisle, comparing labels, when he saw her. Amanda pushed a shopping cart down the parallel aisle, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, wearing clothes he'd never seen her in before, worn and frayed. Her cart held generic brands, cheap staples, and basic necessities. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped, her face etched with a resignation he didn't recognize. Their eyes met briefly. Amanda froze, her eyes widening slightly. Charles gave a polite, neutral nod and went back to examining the wines. Beside him stood Jennifer, a fellow architect he'd recently started getting to know better. She was smart, independent, and successful on her own merit. She picked up a bottle and made a comment about the vintage, and Charles smiled in agreement, fully present in the moment. Amanda looked away and pushed her cart down the next aisle, disappearing from view. Charles selected 2 bottles of wine, paid, and left the store with Jennifer, chatting about dinner, the new project, and weekend plans. He didn't look back. That night, while preparing dinner in his apartment, Charles reflected on how much his life had changed. His 12 years with Amanda now felt like a distant chapter, a painful but necessary lesson. He'd learned about trust, about not confusing provision with love, and about seeing people for who they really are, not who you wish they'd be. Amanda had chosen the easy path, living off him, filling her emptiness with multiple affairs instead of honestly confronting her own dissatisfaction. Now she faced the consequences: 8 hours a day at a job that barely covered her bills, returning to an empty apartment without friends, luxuries, or the comfortable life she'd taken for granted. Charles didn't take pleasure in it, not exactly, but he felt a quiet sense of justice, a confirmation that actions have consequences, that lies eventually collapse, and that truth always finds its way to the surface. Trevor paid a price too. He lost Charles's friendship, something he eventually admitted he'd valued more than he realized. He lost respect within their shared social circles, and his reputation in the community never fully recovered. Amanda tried to stay in touch with him for a few weeks after the divorce, but Trevor quickly realized what they'd shared wasn't love, it was just the thrill of forbidden excitement. Without that, there was nothing left. Marcus, the personal trainer, carried on with his life without major fallout, though he lost several clients once the scandal quietly spread. Ethan, the photographer, simply vanished, proof he'd never been invested in anything beyond a fleeting fling. That evening, Charles poured wine for his guests, laughed at jokes, debated architecture, and felt genuinely present and alive in a way he hadn't experienced during the final years of his marriage. Jennifer sat beside him, her eyes bright as she argued passionately about sustainability in urban design, and Charles realized he was drawn not just to her looks, but to her substance, intelligence, and independence. Weeks turned into months. Charles continued thriving professionally, took on the West Coast project, and spent 3 weeks in San Francisco overseeing the launch. He made new friends, broadened his horizons, and traveled to places Amanda had never cared to visit. He began to understand that his marriage to her had, in many ways, been a gilded cage he'd built himself, working tirelessly to sustain an illusion of happiness that had never been real. A year after the divorce, Charles was at a networking event when he received a message from an unknown number. It was Amanda. The message was short: "Saw your photos from San Francisco. Looks like you're doing well. I'm happy for you." Charles read it, didn't reply, and blocked the number. There was nothing left to say. The chapter was closed, the page turned, the book shut. He looked around the event, at smiling faces, animated conversations, unfolding opportunities. Jennifer stood across the room, chatting with potential clients, occasionally glancing his way and smiling. Charles smiled back, raised his champagne glass in a silent toast, and returned his attention to the conversation in front of him. Life went on. And this time, he was truly living it. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.